It was the first warm weekend of the Finnish summer. 4 teenagers, a tent, a lake that caught the light like glass. By 6 o'clock the next morning, 3 of them were dead. The 4th was found unconscious outside the collapsed tent, his face shattered, his clothes soaked in blood. Over 60 years have passed, dozens of investigators, multiple suspects, 1 acquittal, and still no answer. This is the story of the Lake Bodom murders, Finland's most haunting unsolved crime. Today we are going to Finland, to a lake on the outskirts of Espoo. In 1960, it was a place where teenagers went camping on summer weekends, a place that felt safe, a place surrounded by forest and bird song and the particular quiet of Nordic summer nights. On the 5th of June that year, 3 teenagers were murdered at that lake in an attack of extraordinary violence. Their killer was never caught. In the decades that followed, the case spawned multiple suspects, a sensational trial in 2004, and a cultural impact so profound that one of Finland's heavy metal bands named themselves after it. But the names that matter most in this story are not the suspects. They are the victims. Maila, Anja, Seppo. Finland in 1960 was a country only 15 years removed from the end of the Second World War. It was rebuilding, it was cautious, and it had the particular kind of social trust that comes from small communities where everyone knows everyone. Espoo, on the southwestern edge of the Helsinki metropolitan area, was one of those communities. Quiet, familiar, safe. On Saturday, the 4th of June, 1960, all 4 of them climbed onto motorbikes and rode out to the southern shore of Lake Bodom, Bodominjärvi in Finnish. A beautiful lake, not far from Espoo, edged by forest and popular with campers in the warmer months. They spent the evening together, talking the way teenagers do. Around midnight, the 4 of them went to sleep inside the tent. At some point in the early hours, the boys went fishing at the lake's edge, a common enough thing in that part of the world, where fish bite in the pale summer night. Then they returned and went back to sleep. No one knows exactly what the next few hours held. At approximately 6 o'clock in the morning on the 5th of June, 1960, a group of young boys had gathered near Lake Bodom on a bird-watching excursion. They were some distance from the campsite, but close enough to notice something. They saw the tent collapse, and they saw a blond man walking away from the site. That description, a blond man walking away, would become one of the most discussed details in a case full of disputed details. When the scene was properly discovered, it was a horror. 3 of the 4 teenagers were dead. Anja Maki and Seppo Boisman were found inside the tent. Maila Björklund was found on top of the collapsed tent structure, having suffered the greatest number of injuries. The attack had been carried out from outside the tent. The killer, or killers, had struck through the fabric of the tent itself, using a knife and what forensic examiners would later describe as an unidentified blunt instrument, possibly a rock. Nils Gustafsson, the 4th member of the group, was found outside the tent. He was alive, but barely. His facial bones were fractured. He had stab wounds to his body. He was unconscious. The murder weapons were never found. Not the knife, not the blunt instrument. There were no clear footprints leading away from the scene. And then the investigation made its first major mistake. Police arrived at the scene, and what happened next would compromise the investigation for decades. The crime scene was not cordoned off. The area was left open, and bystanders moved through it. The contamination was immediate and irreversible. Police reportedly failed to take complete official records of their findings at the scene. In a modern investigation, a crime scene like this would be sealed within minutes. Every footprint photographed, every fiber collected, every surface swabbed. In Finland, in 1960, that did not happen. What little physical evidence remained was already compromised by the time any serious documentation began. Gustafsson was taken to hospital. When he regained consciousness, investigators asked him what he remembered. His account was fragmented. The violence had been sudden, the night dark. But there was one detail he gave them. He said he had seen the attacker's eyes. Bright red eyes. A figure dressed in black. Whether this was a genuine memory, a trauma response, or something altered by the disorientation of severe head injury, no one can say. What it did was start the rumors. The stories that would swirl around Lake Bodom for the next 60 years. And as those stories grew, investigators turned their attention to the living, to the suspects. In the weeks and months following the murders, Finnish police received a flood of tips, theories, and accusations. 3 names would rise above the noise as the primary suspects over the course of the investigation's long history. The first was a local man named Carl Valdemar Gillström. Gillström operated a kiosk at Oita, the very estate near which the teenagers had set up their tent. He was well known to locals, and he was well known for one particular thing. He was hostile toward campers. Aggressively so. People who used the lakeside for recreation reported having unpleasant encounters with him. In the immediate aftermath of the murders, local suspicion settled on Gillström quickly. Community memory is long in small places. People talked. There was more to his profile than general hostility. The pattern of incidents involving Gillström stretched back years. Documented confrontations, verbal threats, and aggressive warnings to anyone who used the lake near his property. Multiple locals gave statements describing a man with a hair-trigger temper and a specific fury toward campers he viewed as trespassers. Police collected these accounts. They formed a picture of someone who, in the language of investigators, had both motive and proximity. But the police could not find hard evidence connecting him to the crime. There were reports that Gillström had made statements that some interpreted as confessions, though these were vague and disputed, and police remained skeptical. In 1969, 9 years after the murders, Carl Valdemar Gillström drowned himself in Lake Bodom, the same lake. Years later, on her deathbed, his wife made a statement that went largely unnoticed for some time. She recanted his alibi for the night of the murders. He had not been where she initially said he was. Whether that means he was at the lakeside campsite, no one knows for certain. The second suspect attracted attention not from the local community, but from investigators and popular writers who studied the case in later years. His name was Hans Assmann, a German-born man who had become a naturalized Finnish citizen. He lived several kilometers from the shore of Lake Bodom. The morning of the 6th of June, 1960, the day after the murders, Assmann walked into the Helsinki Surgical Hospital. He was in a state of confusion. His fingernails were blackened with dirt, and his clothing was covered in red stains. The hospital doctors who treated him were concerned enough about those stains to note them formally. They believed the stains were blood. They insisted on this. Police were made aware of Osman's condition, and then they made a decision that has been questioned ever since. They did not collect his clothing for examination. They did not test the stains. Their explanation? The red marks were paint. Osman had been working at a site where red paint was used, and he had been drinking. That was their conclusion. The stained clothing was never formally tested for blood. Not in 1960. Not ever. There is more. In the days following the murders, Finnish news reports released a description of the man the bird-watching boys had seen leaving the crime scene. Tall, blonde hair, walking away. After those reports aired, Hans Osman cut his long blonde hair. When Gustafsson's recollections were later gathered under hypnosis, he described the figure he had seen as having long blonde hair. Despite all of this, police declared that Osman had a solid alibi and removed him from active consideration. His bloody clothes remained untested. The investigation continued. Cold leads, conflicting witness accounts, a contaminated crime scene that could yield nothing useful. By the early 1980s, the Lake Bodom murders had the status that investigators dread most. Cold case. And for decades, there it stayed, until 2004. In late March 2004, 44 years after 3 teenagers were killed at Lake Bodom, Finnish police made an announcement that stunned the country. They had arrested the sole survivor. Nils Gustafsson, then 62 years old, a pensioner, a man who had spent his adult life carrying the trauma of that night, was taken into custody on suspicion of committing 3 murders. The announcement was seismic. In Finland, this was not a forgotten case. This was a case that had been discussed around kitchen tables for 2 generations. And now the police were saying they believed the man who had been found battered and unconscious at the scene had in fact been the killer all along. What was the new evidence? British forensic scientists had examined Gustafsson's shoes from that night, shoes that had been retained as evidence. They reported finding traces of the victim's blood on those shoes. The prosecution built their theory around this finding and the pattern of the bloodstains found across the scene. Their interpretation was this: Gustafsson had been drunk. A confrontation had broken out between him and Seppo. He was excluded from the tent. The argument escalated. His jaw was broken in the fight with Boisman, and in his rage, Gustafsson became the killer. In June 2005, he was formally charged with 3 counts of murder. The trial was one of the most closely watched in modern Finnish legal history, and on the 7th of October 2005, Nils Gustafsson was found not guilty on all charges. The court's reasoning was careful and specific. The prosecution had failed to establish a motive proportionate to the extreme violence of the crime. The blood evidence on the shoes, while present, was not conclusive proof of guilt. The court noted that a survivor of such an attack would be expected to have the victim's blood on his person. And critically, the eyewitness account from the birdwatching boys, a blond man walking away from a collapsed tent, was consistent with an external perpetrator, not with Gustafsson as the attacker. The court also noted something that has haunted this case since the very beginning. Certainty is now impossible. 45 years had passed. The crime scene had been contaminated in 1960. Evidence had degraded. What might once have been provable in either direction simply could not be proven anymore. Gustafsson walked out of that courtroom a free man, and the case returned to where it had been for decades. Unsolved. Today, the Lake Bodom murders remain officially unsolved. There is no living suspect who has been formally charged. Gillström died in 1969. Osman is long gone, his bloody clothing never tested. Gustafsson was acquitted and is elderly. The original crime scene evidence is compromised beyond recovery. What remains are the theories, and there are many. Lake Bodom is still there. It is still beautiful. People still camp on its shores. And somewhere in the archives of Finnish criminal history, the file is still open.